everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to this DCG webinar called Church Property Stewardship 101. My name is Megan MacIver and I'm a Vice President at DCG Strategies, and I'm joined by our CEO and founder, Landis Graydon. Landis. We're going to be recording today's session and also distributing it online so that folks can learn along with us. Today we're going to be talking about Church Property Stewardship 101. So this is really a broad-ranging presentation which has a pretty ambitious scope, but we're going to really be talking about three key things that churches are interested in with regards to real estate. The first is development and how that can advance ministry, and the second is leasing and sales. So we'll just get right into it. I'll begin with an introduction to the firm. Here's a little bit of information about who we are. DCG Strategies is a real estate consulting and brokerage firm, and we're dedicated to working with religious communities and helping them advance their mission by making the most of their real estate assets. One thing that distinguishes us is that we're both real estate professionals and experts, and everyone in our senior leadership has faith as central to their lives. So we like to say we speak two languages. We understand the church world, we understand the various priorities and goals that faith communities have, and the particular pace at which discernment often proceeds. And we're set up really to walk along the process with churches without rushing them or having our incentives at odds with discernment processes that churches might be going through. We have a very experienced team, and we've done more than $3.4 billion of real estate transactions across California. So we've done more work with churches than any other firm in the state. We're a certified B Corporation, and we really do put people before profits. This is really a calling for us. And so we are here to protect churches and to put ministries first. We work with individual congregations, and we also work with regional church leadership to look at sort of a regional portfolio level view in order to unlock creative solutions that advance ministries. I'd also like to mention that we have a huge part of our mission is providing real estate education to churches. And to that end, we have several programs going on, one of which was last year called the Ministry of Housing. We received grant funding from the San Francisco Foundation to put on a series of educational workshops. We trained over 120 individual congregations in real estate development fundamentals. And now we have another grant opportunity, a support through the Crankstart Foundation to provide educational resources, as well as a series of pre-development feasibility analyses to select congregations in the city and county of San Francisco in what we're calling our SB4 Housing Accelerator Lab. So we're trying to make the most of that important state bill and get as many units as possible built on faith lands. In terms of our services, I'll go quickly through this, but just so you get a sense of what we provide, we provide consulting services, brokerage services, development services by protecting the church, and then we also provide asset management services. Here's a look at our senior team. We all are real estate professionals, and as I said, also active in our faith communities. And Landis founded the corporation 20 years ago. This is our larger team as well. So for today's workshop, we're going to be talking about the importance of church property, understanding your property's potential, and discernment, asking strategic questions that set your congregation up for success. We'll talk first about development strategies and then go into sales and leasing. So the goal of this session is really not to make churches an expert by any means, but to change churches' perspective to view their real estate as a powerful tool for ministry instead of a burden or an obstacle or something that has to be dealt with. And so to do that, as I said, we'll be looking at a series of case studies that will hopefully illuminate this point and expand our imagination about what's possible. I'd like to start with this slide, which has a lot of information, but I think it's important because this is really what we say at DCG are key steps and questions to any church real estate decision. So this could be as simple as leasing out your church property to another congregation to make a little bit of extra income. And it could be as complicated as developing affordable housing, which could take a decade or more. So the first thing, and this is what we always say in terms of any real estate decision, we want to start with discernment and internal alignment. We hope that you and your congregation take the time to do visioning exercise to really articulate and clarify who are we as a church, what are our core values, and what does our community need. Then we want to pair those needs with the spiritual and organizational resources that our community has. We want to identify our gifts, and we want to identify what we're called to do here and now. And really importantly, as a community, we want to articulate how will we know when we've been successful, and does everyone agree on that vision? So this is really the first step of who are we and how do we envision this future that we're called to create. The second step is uncover real estate needs and resources. So we want to make sure that ministries are protected and they come first. So we want to begin with a ministry first needs and resource assessment. So what are the ministries that your congregation engages in, and what space needs do they have today and in the future? The second part of that is to really look at your real estate with new eyes. Imagine new life. Imagine you've never been to this place before. What do you see? Are there underutilized spaces that could be transformed or reused? And then the third step is identify your leaders, your partners, and your plan. So assemble a team of leaders within your congregation to really own this real estate intervention and this project, and also write down and agree on a decision-making structures. Many churches have this in place already, but some don't. And it really simplifies things. Are you going to do it by popular vote? Is there going to be a committee? And then the next part of this is identifying your professional partners. In future webinars, we'll talk about tips for how you can pick the best professional partner for you that's going to be in line with your mission and vision and values. But we're going to tell you how to think about finding that partner for competence and culture fit. And then finally, craft a plan that clearly articulates and protects your mission and ministries. And we'll talk about how to do that effectively in future sessions. So I'd like now to turn to a few case studies regarding development. So as I mentioned, there are kind of three big real estate decisions that congregations make. Congregations might be contemplating a sale of all or part of their property. So we'll talk about how to be successful if that is on the table for your community. Congregations talk about leasing to generate additional income. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, congregations might think about development. So we'll talk about a few case studies that really show how a church's property can become an incredible tool for providing support, services, and care for an entire neighborhood, and in some instances, an entire part of the city. And so for this, I'd like to invite Landis Graydon, who's our CEO and founder, to talk about two case studies, the first of which is Glad Tidings. Hi, Landis.
Hi, thanks, Megan. And good to see everyone. Just really briefly, just want to give you the first of two case studies. One is Glad Tidings. And Glad Tidings has been around for 40 plus years in South Hayward. When they started their ministry, they owned no real estate, and the area that they are still located in South Hayward was, I would say, incredibly socioeconomically disadvantaged, lots of crime, lots of poverty, and just really an area of the county that has just was neglected by public safety, social services, you name it. So Bishop Macklin, the founder and the visionary pastor who is still there, had a vision, and he wanted to figure out a way to take the real estate in the community and repurpose it for the good of the community. And so he ended up leasing the first space for the church. They eventually purchased that property. They went around the corner, found some vacant land, built a new church there, went across the street, acquired 62 units of apartments, which is that is the more recent photo that was really a drug den. It's since been redeveloped as affordable housing. They built a new family life center adjacent to the church and a number of projects and programs. And that's a really that's a great photo of a lot of the campus. Now, I can't point it out because it's not flagged, but they own the church owns blocks and blocks of real estate. The community development corporations there, a multi-purpose gymnasium, wellness centers there. The church has two main facilities, affordable housing within a couple of different properties, and several other. So that's a shot of the church, and when on the left is the wellness center gymnasium as it was getting built. Across, right above the church, like top right hand, is one of the affordable housing projects. At the back of the parking lot, you can almost see some apartments. That's another affordable housing project. And if we were going to the left of this photo, my left, looking at the screen, the church owns pretty much that entire block on both sides of the street. And there were condos developed. So the point was, the church was able to create a place using resources that it raised from nonprofits, public sources, the community and members. And it started with a vision. And again, the church, when they began, had no money and no real estate, and they built up this entire community. So now if you were to walk into that neighborhood, property values are strong, very, very low crime, and the entire area has benefited, and including all the members that have passed through those doors over the years. I was a member there for a couple of decades, and I had the privilege of running the Community Development Corporation and doing some of these real estate projects that I mentioned. So that's one example of a church that had an entrepreneurial spirit and wanted to just go throughout the neighborhood and take what was at the time many properties that were, like I said, drug dens and crack houses, et cetera. And they have since been converted to affordable housing, community programs, and a host of home ownership opportunities, et cetera. So that's the Glad Tidings story. It's there in South Hayward, and they're Bishop Malcolm is welcoming tours and information. There's a lot documented about the story there. Pastor Agee came to us, this was pre-pandemic or somewhere around there. His church was in West Oakland, and he tells a story. He's been serving there for decades as the senior pastor of Friendship Community Church. His calling was also in the 80s, similar to Bishop Macklin, during the crack epidemic. And at that time, he was called to do drug intervention and drug rehabilitation because that was a major need, and that's what his calling was from God. And he talks about that often. So over the years, the church has been very ingrained in the community, providing lots and lots of services. And in recent years, he had a vision to create affordable housing. Now, West Oakland, because of what was happening with San Francisco real estate, in terms of the drastic increase in prices and home values and rent values, it drove people from San Francisco into Oakland. And then that began to raise the values for those indigenous Oakland people because they were now competing with San Francisco transplants with San Francisco salaries. And he saw a lot of seniors displaced. And so recently, and when I say recently, this is right around the pandemic, so I want to almost say 2018-ish, he had a vision to wanting to go into affordable housing. So he did some research, he called us, and he said, I have a piece of property, I have a high level understanding of what affordable housing is from having talked to some folks, but I'm very interested in moving into that next chapter for our ministry. So this is a conversation that he and I were having. So we sat together, we made a plan. He explained to me his non-negotiables, which was really he did not want to vacate the location. So the church had its building and he wanted to somehow, some way stay post development. And so that became, I would say, the primary criteria for him. So we were able to assemble a development team. We educated him on his options. He picked Community Housing Development Corporation, which is in Richmond, as his development partner. He, being the church, became co-developer, which is one of the options when ministries go through affordable housing. We always ask them to at least consider co-developer because you can share in the revenue upside as well as have some control in the program and the process going forward. And so Friendship became a co-developer in this project. They're going to build 50 units of senior housing where their church used to stand. And I say used to because the building's pretty much built now. And the church will remain on site. So you can see the rendering of before and after. So they're creating the units for senior housing, affordable, subsidized. The church will remain on site in the commercial space. The church is also sharing in the revenue, which, it could be seven figures. And the new phase of their ministry has begun. So that began with a vision and a calling to shift. They still do a lot of their historical programs, but this was a big shift for them. And so we're happy to report that they have been successful in getting their building built. And I think they're still doing the finishing touches of construction. And I anticipate they'll be moving into the new property at the end of this year.
Great, thank you, Landis. I think these are really powerful ways to understand the potential of a church's calling and to really reimagine what ministry means in a really expansive sense. And I think when you talk to Reverend Dr. A.J., he says that he feels called to a neighborhood and not just to his church. And I think that perspective really gave rise to this extremely bold and creative development program that community is able to undertake, which is really reshaping not just the church, but the area around the church. So the second sort of set of topics that churches might face that we think are really important to facilitating excellent stewardship of church resources are selling and leasing. The decision to sell is an extremely important one to a congregation and is not entered into lightly. But we're here today to kind of provide a little bit of information about what to look out for and outline a basic sales process and key terms in a sale, just so that communities are empowered to feel fully informed when they're making that decision. The other part that we'll be talking about in this part of the webinar is a few leasing strategies. So key terms and things to look out for when you're considering leasing or generating additional income for your congregation. So I'll start here with the basics of negotiating a lease. We want to think about a lot of things with a lease agreement. This is important for churches because often what I've seen happen is congregations come to a point in their lives where they're looking to create additional income. Sometimes this can happen when a congregation feels really stressed. They might have bills to pay, and sometimes that feeling of stress can lead to lease arrangements or agreements that might not protect the interests of the congregation in the long term. And this can happen for a variety of reasons, but we want to create a space for congregations to understand fundamental leasing terms so that they can make the right decision for their ministries. So certainly when you're negotiating a lease, you can work with a professional broker who can help you with this. But we want to think about a couple of key terms. Obviously, rent is the amount of money that you'll be paying over time, that tenant will be paying over time to occupy the space. And a lease is very different from a use agreement. So you might have a use agreement with maybe Alcoholics Anonymous or something like that, where a community group is able to use a space for a certain amount of time. A lease is something different. It's a binding legal agreement that really explains all of the ways that that tenant is able to occupy a space, and also it clarifies the landlord's responsibilities. So when we think about leases in general, we also want to understand the duration of a lease. So not just how many years it exists, but we also want to think about renewal options. So sometimes tenants come to churches and they say, look, we are interested in leasing out this space for our school, or even for perhaps an adult daycare program. And our lease is going to be 5 years, but we want renewal options that will allow us to remain in that space for, you know, five-year renewal options. It's important for churches to understand with renewal options that that really puts the ball in the court of the tenant. And so if you are engaged in a lease agreement with renewal options, that means that the tenant often has the option to renew that agreement for all of that period, which could mean that instead of the lease lasting 5 years, it could last decades. We've seen this in a couple of instances, and we'll talk about that in the case studies coming up, but it's just important to make sure that you understand exactly the duration of the lease and who has control over when the lease ends. The other important thing, which is related to defining triple net leases versus gross leases, is maintenance responsibilities. Often churches don't know that tenants can be made to participate in common area charges. So when you enter into a lease, one thing to look at is who's responsible, for example, for the cost of a new roof if it's required. So a triple net lease, that's often abbreviated with the letters NNN, really shifts the responsibility for maintenance to the tenant. Contrast that with a gross lease, in which the landlord really covers a lot of the maintenance, all of the maintenance costs actually, and the tenant simply pays a fixed rental rate. So as a church, that's important to know, because you want to basically decide where and how those responsibilities for common area maintenance are going to be distributed between the owner and possible tenants. I think as well, there are a lot of impacts to ministry operations with having tenants constantly using the site. Some of those impacts could come from, churches that have children on the site, which would then restrict the availability of that site to other uses in order to protect the children. So, of course, it's important to find a simpatico tenant that is going to be a part of contributing to the overall community health and well-being, and that can take some time. So here are a few red flags in lease agreements, and I've covered a few of them, but one thing that we see churches run into often is there's ambiguity in terms of who is responsible for maintenance and repair. So it's important to clarify those also for the church's relationship with the tenant. We also see ambiguous space usages and access agreements. So it's really important to have a floor plan and a clearly demarcated, especially if you have a campus, a clearly demarcated sense of what parts of the campus that tenant can use at what time, and make that part of the lease agreement. We've also talked about overly long-term leases or extensions that lock in low rents and limit future availability. We want to make sure that rent increases and the ability to keep up with market standard rent is something that's factored into the lease itself. So in terms of negotiating lease agreements, here are a few things for churches to consider as they come to that negotiating table. The goal is really to, of course, negotiate favorable terms that maximize income while minimizing risk. So again, just making sure that those terms are as clear as possible. Going back to the slide that we showed earlier about what makes a good real estate decision for churches, any tenant that comes into the church's community should be in harmony with the church's overall space needs and flexibility for future ministry needs. And that's part of the early phases of the discernment process where the church really clarifies that not only what spaces the church needs for its ministry today, but what the church is going to need or thinks it will need or projects to need for the next 10 years or however long the lease agreement is in place. We also want to think about early termination rights if tenants don't meet the expectations that churches have. So we want to think about ways that the church can protect itself if the tenant fails to live up to its responsibilities or to its agreement. So if a tenant doesn't pay rent, if a tenant does not respect those lease agreements or allows a use that is not compatible or harmonious with the church, those need to be represented in the lease agreement as well. Here's a cautionary tale. So this is a bit of a case study. We know of a congregation in a really desirable part of the Bay Area. The congregation had been kind of declining for a number of years. They had no financial ability to call a pastor, so they were down to about 3 parishioners. I talked about churches that sometimes get themselves into a bind if they feel like they absolutely need to get their hands on an income stream. What happened in this particular case was the renewal options were excessive. So the church agreed to a lease with 16 or so 2-year extensions. And that meant that their school tenant had the ability to decide for the duration of 16 2-year increments whether they wanted to continue at that space. And so the church really ceded control of their property to the tenant that they leased to. And this really blocked and encumbered and limited the congregation's options. So the church no longer had the opportunity when the time came to go to the market to see, for example, whether a developer might be interested because it was what we call encumbered by a very lengthy lease. So when you're drafting leases, just make sure to take a look at those renewal options. And standard renewal options or lease length can vary, but typically we see leases on the order of 5 to 6 years. Again, that can vary church to church, region to region, but just make sure that those renewal options are really ironclad and support your ministry. We have a success story here. There were, and this is really the importance of making sure that churches understand what a market rate rent is. And professionals can help you determine that. We can help you determine that. But in this case, there was a church that had, and we see this all the time, churches have underpriced, outdated leases. And there were concerns about, mounting repair costs and future sustainability. One part of the church was used for a daily community service, and another part was used for worship on Sundays, which was then also rented out during the week. And so the church recognized that, hey, these market rents are not what we know. The rents that are in place do not reflect current market realities. We're missing out on possible income. And so we were retained to help with the negotiations, and we successfully renegotiated one of the leases and brought that up to a market rate so that the church could receive income that it needs for its ministry. And then with the other lease that was not successful, that tenant left, but then DCG found a new tenant, which then paid market rate. And so we want to make sure as well to vet tenants carefully. And real estate professionals can really help you with this. If you're thinking about bringing a tenant onto your campus, we want to make sure that that tenant is solid. First of all, they can pay their bills, but second, that they are mission aligned. And there's a diligence process that a real estate professional can help you go through to make sure that the correct partner is selected as a tenant for your property. So that's kind of a very, very, very high level overview of a few things to watch out for when constructing leases in order to generate income. The second topic that I'll talk about now is understanding property sales. So again, churches might consider property sales. It's not the right answer for everyone, but if a church is interested in this topic, here are a few things to look out for. The first is, of course, and this is something that we say all the time, is does selling the property support the church's long-term ministry goals? Um, what is this community's vision for its building, for its community? I kind of have started to think of church buildings as people, like they have personalities, which means that they can be healthy, they can be sick, they can be at various stages of their life cycle. And sometimes church life cycles last 1,000 years. Other times church lifespans last 80 years or 200 years. So where is our church in our life cycle, and how do we honor kind of the sacredness of that life that is that community life, that is where that congregation is at that moment? The second question we want to think about before we even think about selling is, what impact might this sale have on the congregation and the community? Churches are community centers, of course, not just for the folks who worship there and are part of the community, but for the entire parish, for the entire neighborhood that surrounds it. So what would that mean for this community to lose that church? And can we identify the partners that might be affected by a change in ownership? The other thing we want to look at is, what are current market trends? So in some cases, it's not the right time to sell a church. And DCG is an expert in church sales, so we really know for any given region and building type exactly who's in the market for that church. But we also can advise you to perhaps wait if it's not a good time in the market for that transaction to come online. So just knowing when to time the sale is an important consideration. But of course, the number one thing is just really knowing what it is that your community is hoping for in this transaction. What is your vision? What is your desired outcome? As we talked about in that first slide, what will success look like for us, and how will we know when we get there? Here are a few kind of red flags or pitfalls in property sales that we see and would urge folks to look out for. So the first is failing to get a proper valuation. So we see a lot of church communities maybe not knowing exactly how much their building would sell for should it go to market. This is an important thing to just know, because often developers knock on churches' doors. They come with all types of offers, and I just think it's a great idea for churches to have a really clear sense of how a developer might value their property, for example. How are they underwriting it? What assumptions are they using? How much density could be achieved on that site? It's just important to have a sense for how a church property fits into the marketplace. So having a proper valuation that's done by a professional who is an expert in church property sales. People might not know this, but there's a really big difference between residential properties and church properties in commercial real estate. Churches are an extremely specialized asset, and they don't work the same way as residential sales. The buyer pool is different. The way that they're valued is different. And so we want to make sure that whoever is providing that valuation has a really clear sense of the church marketplace, especially in the particular area where you're located. The second thing we want to look out for is not vetting buyers. So it's important, if buyers come to the table, that they're fully understood and that they're examined, both in terms of their overall viability, purchasing power, as well as their culture fit with the church. Is this buyer someone that you can trust, and that you can trust the legacy, the sacred legacy of your worship space to for the future? And that goes with the third bullet point, of course, settling for offers that could harm the church's mission or property future. The other thing we want to look out for is, and this goes along with vetting buyers, we want to avoid selling to an opportunistic buyer who plans to resell at a higher price. So this goes back to vetting buyers. This can happen. Churches might think, oh, wow, this nonprofit sounds really great. Here's their mission. This is what they want to do with our property. Sell it, and then sell it perhaps at a discount to market value. And then that organization might turn around and 2 years later sell it for a much higher price. So we never want to see that happen to churches, which is why it's really important to investigate the possible buyers. Because again, this is a sacred place. It's not just a random space, and we want to make sure that the legacy and the life of that place is protected well into the future. The other pitfall, and this is pretty unfortunate, is that sometimes there could be a huge disagreement that can result in community fracture or a community disbanding around whether to sell or not. And so that's the importance of articulating a mission and vision and values that's shared by the congregation. And then that's really agreed on by whatever decision-making mechanism you've decided. If we think about successful sales, we see a couple of things in common with successful sales processes. The first is selecting the right professional partner. Often we hear of congregations that say, oh, well, we have, Sam in our congregation. He is a real estate broker. He can help us with the sale. That might work for some congregations, but more often than not, we really see a better chance of success with a professional who specializes in church real estate and not just commercial real estate, residential real estate, excuse me. And not only that, but a professional partner who can be patient with you, who can attend council meetings, who spends the time to get to know you, to get to know your mission, your vision, your culture, and who's not going to rush that transaction because they have some target to meet. So finding that right professional partner that feels right and that is in harmony with your community. We talked about the importance of selling to a buyer aligned with mission. Then the other part of successful sale is really what I would talk about as legacy. So what will be the result of this sale? Is it that you're growing and you need new space, and the legacy of that sale is going to be to empower your community to grow, to enter a new space, to make an additional purchase that's going to enable ministry to continue far into the future in a new location? Is your legacy to, stop worshiping as that community and use the proceeds from the sale to fund a foundation or charitable giving, or another kind of mission that your church feels it's responsible for? But really getting the community to be in love with the legacy of that sale is super important in order to facilitate the process that undoubtedly will happen, which is a grieving process and just a process of change. And so having that really clear sense of where this is headed and the ways that this sale will serve the continuity and the creation of a vision is really important. I'll talk about a success story which I find really inspiring. This is a story about a congregation called Holy Redeemer Newark. This congregation spent years really discerning their future. They were a dwindling congregation and they had reached the end of their worshiping life. Part of what they did was they looked around and did a resource assessment and found that there was a partner church not so far away, and they started over a period of time to grow closer to that congregation. It was also in the ELCA, which is the denomination of this church. So that congregation started to make plans to merge with the neighboring congregation, and this was something that went on for years. So this discernment process was clear. Folks had grieved together. They created containers to have these hard conversations about what their legacy was going to be, and they didn't want to just let things go. They wanted to take a decision that would allow them to really create the legacy that they wanted, and they wanted to share this gift. So what they did was they actually went out to the marketplace and marketed it very broadly. So the property, as you can the property is in a desirable kind of residential neighborhood. And the church marketed it as broadly as possible. They received interest from developers who wanted to develop the property, and a lot of churches. Ultimately, what ended up happening was the church decided to sell to a former tenant of theirs, which was a Hungarian church, and that church was able to pay as much as a developer. Then the church also decided to sell part of its lawn, which was not useful to the new buyer, to a residential developer, and they achieved very high pricing for selling a portion of their underutilized lawn to that residential developer. And then what happened was the congregation decided to create something called the Seeds of Life grant. So with the proceeds, which was in the millions, close to 5 million, the congregation created a program to which all the churches in the Lutheran region could apply, as well as nonprofits. And those proceeds were then distributed to those organizations and churches and ministries. And so this is the image that they have, which I think is really beautiful. This, this image of, this congregation really honored its congregational life, decided to sell, and then shared those proceeds with ministries across the region.